Hi, everyone. Welcome to Open Door Philosophy. I'm Derek Parsons.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew, and welcome to another episode of the Open Door Philosophy Podcast.
That's right. Episode 93. We're talking today about the self, part one of a multi-part series. So we're excited to do that. But anyway, before we get going, Andrew, you're on the road.
I'm on the road. I'm doing a podcast traveling tour where we're recording in a number of cities. No, I'm kidding, but in fact, I did see something like that this past week. I was lucky to watch a live recording of the Advisory Opinions podcast with Sarah Isgur and David French. David French is somewhat famous for being
The actor
uh,
guy?
no,
Oh,
but
okay.
I understand the confusion there. He's a political commentator.
Okay.
He's yeah, a bit controversial, but
Oh,
that
wait.
was cool to see another podcast.
Oh, I bet it was. Is he the guy that writes opinions for New York Times?
Yes,
Ah,
that's
okay.
correct.
Okay. That's where I know that
Yes.
name from.
So that
Okay.
was interesting to see another podcast get up and running. I think I have to say we have way better dad jokes than he does. Uh, but it was still fun to see.
Oh, that's interesting. Where was it?
They were recording at Duke Law School, and so
Okay.
they had this kind of concept where they would go around to different places and record podcasts. I think this might be
Sure.
some kind of standard thing.
Yeah.
There's a very famous, so my impression of that podcast was that it was slightly more right-leaning.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another very famous legal podcast called Five to Four. They're somewhat more left-leaning, and
Okay.
they'll be coming in a few weeks. So it'll be interesting to see. Maybe I'll be at both, but it's interesting to see how other podcasts work live because. So anyway, that's my exciting update for the week. How's everything been going with you?
Everything's going fine. I'm on the tail end of my fall break, and like any good teacher and student, I procrastinated, and I'm getting a little bit of grading done. Delayed gratification. It did not work for me. I was immediately gratified, and now I'm paying the price by grading essays on the last weekend of my break. But that's okay. These are just the choices we make. And we're all anxiously awaiting what might be called autumn in Houston. It is like 93 degrees today or something. And it's the 12th of October. So come on, autumn. At least it's cooler in the evenings these days. So
I've heard that you've had some spells of cold fronts coming through, although I don't know if they're particularly correctly labeled as
cold.
cold fronts. But but I hope those do come soon. I will be back in Houston this upcoming week, which is very exciting. And
Yeah,
the weather in North Carolina has been beautiful, so that's good, I suppose.
that is good. That is good. We've also had two hurricanes since we last recorded.
That's right.
Our thoughts are with all the people in Florida and the Carolinas and everywhere else that's suffering from that. It's interesting having lived in Houston for so many years and gone through a few, and I relate to that suffering in a way that I did not when I lived in Oklahoma or Central Texas.
Absolutely.
Well, golly, I guess we should just get into it. I don't have any clever segues.
Well, I have something.
Oh,
I have
please.
a mean-spirited comment as always, I suppose. Do you feel, and I'll answer this after, do you feel odd or slightly narcissistic that we have an episode called The Self?
Well, I guess I would if I were talking about myself. But one of the great
So,
questions is, what do we mean when I say talking about myself?
so this is not an episode where we're talking about ourselves, just to make clear, because I had prepared extensive documents.
Oh, did you? Was it
Uh-oh.
was it going to be like a?
It was going to be a life story, I think. Well, both. I had a song to add too, so.
Wow, that's good. Well, no, it's not about myself or Andrew's self, or might we
It's a
say
shame.
Andrew's identity? I don't know. We
Hmm.
got to talk about all that stuff. But yeah, this is a big topic in philosophy. Tremendous amount of time has been spent on it by philosophers throughout the centuries. I don't know how much of a hot topic it is these days. Some of the related fields that we'll talk about in a moment are, well, I don't know why I'll say in a moment, I'll just say it now. Consciousness is a big field, and identity is a big field. And the self, identity, and consciousness are all very much so linked. Many people conflate the self and identity as like the same thing. There are philosophers who maintain that those are separate things, those are different things. So we'll talk about that distinction here in a minute. That's what we're going to be talking about today.
When we were thinking about this, I felt a little uncomfortable talking about it because it's not something that I felt particularly knowledgeable about. However, after doing some reflection, I think I can make the claim, or at least an argument for the claim, depending, I think people will disagree if it's true or not, but I think philosophers on the self perhaps might be the most revolutionary concept in all of philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that's true for a number of reasons. And we'll get into them as we go through the accounts and how accounts of this concept have changed throughout the centuries. But if we think about this in our own minds for a second, what could be more fundamental than thinking of ourselves and what that means? And then on the other hand, thinking about what that means for other individuals. And so when we think about it in that kind of way, not as surprising, I think, that this is such a revolutionary question for people, philosophers, rulers, everyday people to be thinking about. And so I think when we're thinking about these questions, it's important to not lose sight of how revolutionary any of these theories are
Hmm.
in thinking about individuals and how they live in the world. It is a fundamental question that comes before, I think, the fancy philosophical term here. uh, I think there could be two, but the one that I'm thinking of is it's an ex ante question. It comes before questions of ethics and aesthetics, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these questions because it's concerned with fundamental nature. So don't lose sight of that. It's important, but it's easy to lose sight of.
That's a really great way to introduce and think about this topic, because it is something that of course we all share, and yeah, it's absolutely fundamental to who we are. And so, when you think about, sometimes people, or philosophy rather, gets one of those uh, opinions that it's kind of fruitless, or we're just messing around with terms and ideas and thinking about things that aren't practical. And if we use our minds to do things that are more practical for our society and ourselves, we'd all just be better off and forget that philosophy. But nothing seems more important than the self in some ways. So I think it's a topic certainly worthy of attention. Now, when we talk about the self, yeah, I do want to differentiate between three things. And so if you imagine a Venn diagram, so three bubbles, three circles, we have what we call the self. And that's primarily what we'll be talking about the next couple episodes. Then we have something called identity. And then we have a third thing, consciousness. They all have to do with each other. The self, so let me explain how they are different from each other. The self is the study of what a person, a human being, essentially is. That's a little bit different than human nature, depending on the definition of a self, but it's like essentially what a person is at its depth. That can have some features to it or might not have features to it, depending on what philosopher we're talking about it. Then we have identity. And identity is more about, for lack of a better term, the outward self. And it concerns itself primarily with the maintenance of the self over time. So if we identify ourselves as part of, like, our bodies as part of ourself, we are interested in the question of, like, well, our bodies change over time. How are we still that same? How do we maintain that same identity if our bodies change? Or, when we think of something like memory, how much of ourselves, how much of our identity is our memory, or the clubs that we associate with, or the roles that we play in society, those change over time as well. Everything changes. So identity focuses on the maintenance of that identity over time. And then consciousness certainly has to do with the self. But consciousness is, of course, this thing that we're all doing right now. We're consciously aware of listening to this podcast or recording this podcast, or we're in a space, we're in our car, we're at home, whatever. Consciousness is that subjective experience that we all experience as human beings. And that's part of the self, or can be part of the self. And it's certainly part of identity, because what we perceive can affect our identity. But all those kind of go together, but also can be treated very separately. So this distinction will become clearer as we go throughout these different eras and conceptions of the self. But I just wanted to differentiate between those three before we went any further. So before we get going, we'd like for the listeners to consider some questions when you're thinking about the self. What is your conception of the self? Here are some things that you can think about. Is the self a body consisting of matter? Or is the self your mind? Or is it a combination of those things? Is the self a combination of a body and a mind? And then further, is the self possibly an organism's behavior and functions? So in other words, how we act in the world. Or is the self a person as defined in part by their actions? Like I become a self by the actions that I take in the world. Or is the self what we might consider an immortal soul? And is that also part of the mind? Is the mind and an immortal soul the same thing? And then last but not least, Andrew was joking about talking about his self, his biography. Is the self a kind of narrative that we maintain about our life as we've gone through it? The self is a kind of narrative. Hopefully those questions make you think a little bit in terms of what exactly you think the self is, because again, like Andrew mentioned, it's fundamental, and most things that are fundamental we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. Oddly, we take things for granted, and so everyone has a conception of the self. The question is, how do you conceive of it?
That's right. And let me give an example of how thinking about these in different ways might impact your behavior in the world or your behavior with other people. If I think that the self is, for myself, an immortal soul, then maybe I might make me believe that I need to take care of myself, my soul, however you want to define that, in a certain kind of way. If this is going to be me forever and ever and ever, that's going to change how I treat myself and think about the world. Alternatively, if I think that the self is just some kind of materialistic creature that runs until it stops, that's going to change how I think about the world and others. Because if I think it's all done after this, the self ends at death or whatever, by the time that it decays from the body, perhaps using people might become more appropriate. Maybe it doesn't, but I think that's a common way of thinking about it. And so all of these, depending on how we think about what's true or not, can change a lot. Let me give a final example here that I think is almost a universal experience, might be almost a rite of passage through childhood, which is the solipsistic self,
Hmm.
thinking one is the only self that exists in the world. I don't know which one of these that would fit under. Probably mind. The mind creates the mind. The self is the mind, is the only thing that exists. It's the only self. The whole world is the self almost.
Hmm.
I think advancing past that stage has been said by some social scientists, although I haven't done much research into this, is a normal experience of childhood and something that one must mature beyond. So these are a few ways that thinking about the self can change how we live and experience the world.
And I think it's a matter of definition too. It's really important. For instance, another example, when perhaps we act in anger or we say something we did mean or whatever, and often refrain as, gosh, I just wasn't being myself. And exactly what do we mean by that? Does that mean there's something within you that is unaffected by the actions you take? Something that is essentially or uniquely you? Is that what we say when I'm just not being myself? Or is that a reference to like how you normally act in the world, right? The values that you hold. And are the internal values you hold, is that the same as this more essential self? Does the essential self have values, or values and the essential self separate from each other? So there's a lot baked into this idea of, when we say something like, I'm just not being myself, what do we mean really when we're saying that? I mean, I think what we're practically saying is, I usually don't act that way, or I prefer that I don't act that way. I like to think in my mind that I don't act that way. But we also might be meaning something more than that.
That's a fantastic example, and I think that thinking about these questions, it will be helpful for us to put some terminology and pre-existing notions of what this mean downs in order for us to be able to talk about this more clearly. Are we going to give a broad account of what we're going to cover throughout this series, or should we just jump in?
Yeah, let me give kind of a brief overview historically of different eras or periods, and what the main project was when it came to conceiving of the self, how that's changed, that trajectory of the conception of the self over time. And then for this episode, we're going to spend our time in the ancient world. So we're going to do Plato and Aristotle, up to Augustine, and then we'll hop over to India and look at the Hindus' conception of the self. So, strictly in the ancient period. Now, from the Western perspective, just historically speaking, following this trajectory, the ancient conception of the self is that the self is a soul. And we'll get this with Plato and Aristotle. And over time, that soul, and we'll talk about the differences of what exactly Plato meant when he said soul, which is not exactly the sort of Western Judeo Christian conception of a soul.
Yes.
And then we'll get to Augustine, to this point where the soul is something that is immortal. And that is an idea that holds all throughout the ancient and medieval period as well. Then we can get to the early modern period. We have Descartes, the founder of modern philosophy, of course, and his famous "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum" is so foundational for modern philosophy. And it's the idea that there's this thing called an I, like capital I, you, this mind, and this mind is separate from this body. And that has all sorts of implications that theories of self build on top of that. And then we'll look at David Hume and this idea that we start getting sort of into psychology, although it wasn't called that then, but we start talking about the senses and how our experience of the self is really just what he called a bundle of perceptions. And our mind our brain just organizes all that stuff. And then we'll get to late modern and then like postmodern, and we'll talk about the existentialist, how the self is our actions, and our consciousness. And then we'll do a little Eastern. We'll go look at Hindu explanations of the soul and then the Buddhist explanation. So that's kind of where we're going. That's the trajectory.
Let me just say before we get to Plato, can I preface this with some previous
Oh, yeah.
conceptions of the soul that all feed into this?
Mm-hmm.
By far, Plato in this ancient time is the most influential. However, it comes with some predecessors, of course, not just Socrates, but about 500 years at least worth of what we have today of predecessing beliefs on the soul. Plato will take all of these and distill them into a more philosophical and logical theory for us to take a look at, but it's important for us to have this background. The first place that we see this, where I think it's most clearly preserved, a conception of the self, is in Homer, in
Mm.
Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And while we don't traditionally think of this as a great book of philosophy for the ancients and Plato, it was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's referenced all the time in Plato. It's quoted heavily. In Homer's Iliad, I believe it's in book 19, but I could be wrong, where Patroclus is killed. What we have there is an illustration of the Greek term there is pneumia, life breath. The soul leaves the body
Hmm.
of Patroclus after he is killed. There's a description of this moment when it happens, but the self was seen as this breath, this life force, what will become to known as a soul, which leaves the body. It's something that animates the body from birth, but leaves the body, goes to the underworld for the rest of time. A very dismal view of the self after it leaves the body. And later on, when Achilles meets this kind of ghost of Patroclus, he laments for his old body, and so there might be some connection that threads the body to the soul in a way,
Hmm.
but the soul still exists after the body decays. And so that's running through to Plato. We see similar views from Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Pythagoras famously, of course, believes that after death, the soul is reincarnated into another being. And so we see a Western account of reincarnation come slightly before Plato's age, but as you mentioned, there is this thread running through ancient Greece of an immortal soul. But what happens to that after, and how that changes us in the body and how that interacts with us in the world, does change with Plato. So that was a quick, brief overview of the soul, the self, thought about before Plato.
No, that's great because one of the things I always point out to students, today we debate whether or not there is such a thing as a soul, and if there is a soul of its immortality. This was a question that was not on the table. Well, the immortality was. The question of there being a soul, that was not something people were questioning. It was taken for granted. People had souls, period. And so Plato doesn't spend any time debating whether or not there's a soul. He doesn't spend any time trying to justify that there's a soul.
That's
That
right.
is taken for granted. What Plato's concerned with is whether or not that soul is immortal. We see this in early on. We see Plato, certainly in his early period, we see Plato deal with this, really the ideas of death and the soul for the first time in the Apology of Socrates. Near the end, Socrates gives this stirring speech about what he thinks might happen after he dies. And he says famously, either death is a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, or, as men say, there is a change and the migration of the soul from this world to another. Now, as to whether or not Socrates said that, who knows? He probably did. But here we have Plato early on, at least entertaining this idea of what happens to the soul afterwards. It's either a candle that's snuffed out, or the soul migrates on to another realm or plane. But it's most effectively dealt with in his dialogue Phaedo. But maybe we should differentiate what he means by soul.
Yes, that's right. Suke is how I've heard it pronounced. So the suke could be translated as soul, but it could also be translated as the mind. And I think some translations differ on that depending on how contemporaneous they are, because I think lately, what people will be more happy with. Let me see. Here we go. Yeah, okay. So this one still uses soul, but I've seen translations between as suke as mind or soul
Mm,
before, and I think that the big the big picture here is that, well, as you mentioned, first of all, the most important part of it is that the suke, the mind or the soul, it's an immortal thing that cannot be destroyed
mm.
even after death. We'll get to this when we talk about the Phaedo more, and some arguments that he has for this. Would you also like me to talk about the tripartite version of the suke here?
Oh, sure.
Well, we don't. Let me give a brief overview of a few things, but we can talk about that in a second. But Plato divides the suke down into three parts of it. famously. I would say that's point number two if we're thinking about this in defining suke in order. Three is probably a distinctive feature of Plato thinking about the soul, the self, the psyche, which is where, of course, that word comes from, is that it's kind of split. It's wanting to, of course, it's split in three ways, but it's always kind of vying for order versus chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And fourth, I would say, is that, of course, and I think this will probably be the last point here, is that uh, the soul is immortal because it's primarily the psyche is immortal, is because it's connected to the realm of the forms, which
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about before. But that's what's giving it its immortal nature, and that's our connection with the forms. The fact that the psyche was a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this great bit on so before we exist, we're a part of this world, and then through the birthing process, we forget that we were part of this, and in this world, we're kind of chewed and spit out, and our souls might get better or worse depending on who we are and how we're born into that. But at the end of the day, that's where we're going back to. Last thing I'll say before we go more into this, this leads us to a rather, in my opinion, dark view of the body itself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the soul is a distinctive, removable part of the body. And so we can see the influence of Homer that when the soul, the Suki, enters into the body, it's animated. When it leaves, the body's dead. And so the body itself is not extremely important in this view of the self. It's a vehicle,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Mm-hmm.
something which will die and will never come back after it's gone. And so this is something we need to be charting when we're thinking about all of these different conceptions of the self, is its relation with the body. And here, if we were putting it on a grid, we would say a mortal soul, a very unimportant body.
Yeah, this is the thing that Plato was primarily after, right? Like certainty. In our world, in the world of senses, nothing is certain. Everything changes, including our bodies. And you're right, he was very suspicious of the body. In your tripartite soul conception, the body is three things: it's your urges, it's your emotions, and then it's your mind, or your psyche, or your soul. And the job of your psyche is to control those other parts of your body, because your body is just like out of control, basically. And it comes from, yeah, your soul comes from, Plato's theories are so beautiful, but
That's
because they're
right.
so interconnected, we could talk about so many things right now, like the world of forms. And if you're unfamiliar with that, in class when I teach this, I've already taught the world of forms, and so it makes a little more sense for students at that point. If you're not familiar with the world of forms, now this is very influential. Plato believed in two realms: the realm of senses and the realm of forms. And we live in the realm of senses, the world of senses. And here in the realm of senses, everything is changing, everything is flux, nothing is certain, including our bodies and everything else that exists. And then there's the place called the world of forms, or the realm of forms, and there are all the perfect forms, if you will, of everything that exists. Our bodies are from the world of senses, and therefore our bodies are always changing. Whereas our mind, as he conceived it, was from the world of forms, where things don't change. And so the mind gets plugged into the body, and then there's struggle, probably isn't the right word, but the mind or the soul must be the ruler of the body must be ruled. The mind and the soul, the psyche, is rational, and the body is irrational. The mind is the path to all that is good, whereas the body is an obstacle to good, an obstacle to virtue.
But I think that's a great segue
Yeah.
into the Phaedo. We're starting at the end of it. And let me just add a tiny bit, but then I think this will be a great segue back into the Phaedo. Why does Socrates or Plato care in this moment about the soul before and after and its wrestle with the body? Well, Socrates espoused in the Phaedo that he was okay with death because his entire life had been a constant struggle between the body and its desires, and the self, what it really was, the soul, this immortal creation. And he claimed that one of, if not the most important jobs of philosophy was to plug the self
Mm-hmm.
back into the world of forms and not let the self be corrupted by the limitations of the body. And so he says that he is fine with dying. The Phaedo, as we'll surely talk
Yeah,
about in
let's
a
just talk about
moment,
now.
which I guess I'll just talk about now, is Phaedo meeting with, it's Phaedo, correct? Phaedo's meeting with Socrates right before he's about to die. And well, then there's a whole party that will come in and sit with him before he dies. But it's a discussion about why he's okay with dying. And it's a discussion about, he says, okay, try to convince me that I'm not okay with dying. And I think this is his last, his most compelling argument, that he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't fear death because he's a philosopher. He's been thinking about and trying to separate himself and limit himself from the distractions of the flesh. We can see two things here, but the most important is that the self has a purpose. The self should not be objectively
Mm-hmm.
attracted to things of the flesh, should separate itself from the flesh so that it can continue into the world of forms at the end. And so that's, I think, something we should highlight here is this objectivity of what a good self should be. It's very Platonic there.
Yeah, in fact, I have two quotes here from Phaedo, and I'm sorry, I don't have the notation, and these are from separate parts, but they're close. It says here, the body fills us with all kinds of lusts, desires, fears, phantoms, and a great deal of nonsense, with the result that we really and truly never get a chance to think about anything at all. And then the second one, it has been well and truly proved to us that if we are ever going to gain pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and we must look at things themselves with the soul itself. So there's two really good quotes that go along with what you said related to the problems of the body as Plato saw it.
It's a big problem for him, but the important through line here is for this dialogue is that's well, there's many, but that's one of the reasons he's okay with dying.
Mm-hmm.
In this dialogue, they could or maybe they did pay off the guards so that Socrates could leave and escape from his death. The reason that they're having this dialogue is Socrates is debating why he's not scared of death, why he's okay with dying. And he gives several arguments which are not specific arguments to the self, but many are, and I think the most compelling are here.
So to summarize Plato just very quickly, and that was a very brief treatment of his theory of the soul, that the soul exists. Period. Uh,
Yes,
that's not that's not a question. But the question is the soul is immortal, and he proves this by discussing the dichotomy between the body and the soul, and this dichotomy of realms, world of senses, world of forms. This is where we pick up with, by the way, Plato's theory is very influential, which we'll talk about during the Hellenistic period and development of late Judaism, early Christianity, and views of the body and the spirit. So, but now let's move on to Aristotle, who writes a very well, rather he didn't write it; students wrote it down, but a very influential work called De Anima.
that's right. And this is, again, we can see through lines with how he thinks about the soul into his other writings. The thing that we should take away from Aristotle on the soul is that it has some similarities to Plato,
Mm-hmm,
but there's a big difference.
mm-hmm,
So, similarities, I think, first off, is that the soul, the self, is the animating, and we can hear it from anima. It's the animating thing in our
mm-hmm,
bodies. It's the kind of life essence, very similarly to Plato. Yeah, it not only gives us life, but it gives us kind of of a purpose, which I think we've explored in other episodes. But that self there gives us a purpose for living and a very specific purpose. It gives us our qualities, what we're good at and what we're bad at, and that will eventually lead his way up to the argument and to a good life. But it is all founded on this.
mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that is two things different about Aristotle, which are important. First is on the immortality of the soul and its relation to the body. I think that Aristotle could be read in endorsing a view that the soul could be immortal. It's not certainly put past him. The difference here with Aristotle is it has a much closer connection with the human body. Aristotle would probably not say that the soul could entirely exist without without some relation to the human body. Whereas Plato could say that it's the only thing, the self is only the soul. If it's removed, it could hypothetically be placed in like a squirrel or gerbil or something,
Right.
which I think he says
I think it
bad
is. Yeah.
souls do. For here, it's intrinsically tied together. You can't take a human soul and put it in a squirrel or something. The way that the human soul works is that it's inherently rational. It's inherently in a way that's tied and connected with a human body. And without it, it really could not exist. Now, philosophers, especially I think Christian, Jewish, Muslim philosophers, have read into this that the ties of the body kind of carry over after the soul has left itself or whatever. But even then, even if the soul could be divorced from the body for Aristotle, it would still inherently be a human soul. And we can see that when and if, and you listen to our episodes on Aristotelian ethics, but it carries over. He also thinks about there's different types of souls for different types of creatures. There's a vegetative soul for things like plants and animals, and
Hmm.
this is the big discussion. There's a perceptive soul, which is found in animals and I think even some humans, but mostly animals. This would be a kind of soul that has sensations, perceptions, it can move, has its own desires. The thing that would separate it and the rational soul, which is the human soul, only unique to humans, that the human soul, yes, it can sense and perceive and move and all of these things, but the rational soul can make decisions
Hmm.
for its own good. And so that's interesting. A different, perhaps a difference from Plato, where we'd see any soul can do any of these things. It's just kind of limited to the kind of body that it's in. Whereas Aristotle here would say, yes, everything has a soul, but it's a separate, distinct kind of soul in relation to what kind of thing it's in.
Yeah, and it's a very good explanation. And it's the soul that animates the matter, right?
Yes.
And so when we talk about whether we're talking about plants, we're talking about animals, we're talking about human beings, Aristotle discusses in great length substance and what things are made of. This all comes from his scientific background. We have pure matter, we have substance, shapes, hardness, colors, all these types of properties. They can change, but the substance will continue to have a property of some kind. But the property cannot exist without the substance. I'd like to. This is too superficial, but sometimes I think of Aristotle's explanation of the soul as like a battery. It's the thing that makes a human a human. If we don't have the soul, then
Yes.
our bodies are just matter. And so the example that my students always seem to latch onto when we read De Anima is when Aristotle talks about an axe. He's like, okay, what's really fundamental about an axe? We can talk about what it's made of,
Yes.
what its shape is, what its hardness or color is. But if an axe can't cut, then it's not an axe. It might be a former axe or not a good axe or what. No, it wouldn't even be not a good axe. Not a good axe would even still cut a little bit, but it's the
Yeah.
thing that makes an axe that it cuts. You take away the cutting and all of a sudden you have a hammer or something. I don't know. And so
Yeah.
we have substance, like the substance of the axe is like the head that's made of metal. There's the handle, but if it's not sharpened, if it can't, and it might even be sharpened, but if it can't cut, That's the thing that animates, for lack of a better term, an axe. And so he questions, like, okay, so what is the thing that animates a human being?
That's a great discussion, I think, of a really important aspect of Aristotle on this. We could talk about this more, I'm sure, but we should perhaps move on to the Hellenists. Is that where
Yeah,
you'd?
yeah, that's where I'd like to go, just because I think it's very interesting. When I teach this section, I basically go from Plato to Augustine. Now, Augustine's the fourth century A.D., and that's a long ways away from Plato. That's about 800 years, if I'm doing my math right, which it may not be. Augustine's, other than a wonderful philosopher, is considered one of the founders and fathers of the church, the Catholic Church. Well, unquestionably, the Catholic Church believes that, which was just the church back then. The church believes that the soul is immortal. That's not questioned. So how do we get there? And so as Christianity is, for lack of a better term, an offshoot of Judaism, I kind of wanted to like follow this trajectory of how we get from Plato and Aristotle to Augustine. You have anything to throw in before I ramble for a minute?
No.
Okay. Okay, well then set back. So, Plato, Aristotle, wonderful times. Aristotle was the tutor to this little guy named Alexander the Great, which we've all heard of. And Alexander the Great goes on to be one of the greatest conquerors of history and goes out and conquers what was the Persian Empire at the time. After he died early. I think it was 32 or maybe 36. But after Alexander the Great dies, his generals take over all these territories, and to like make it succinct and but also make sense, areas that are today Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, Israel, Lebanon, and then swinging on down into Egypt, and then all of North Africa, about over to Italy. All of that is influenced by a period that's called Hellenism, which is essentially, with Alexander the Great, it was Macedonian, but they were very Greek in many ways, and Alexander the Great loved the Greeks, for lack of a better term, spread that culture for over 400 years. Think about that. It's a very long time. Spread the Greek culture through those regions over 400 years. Why is that important? Well, when we get to Augustine and his belief of an immortal soul, Augustine was a Platonist. So let's follow this. Let's follow this line of thinking. So it's estimated that the first five books of the Bible were composed about 1600 BC or BCE. At that time, like ancient Judaism did not really have a conception of a soul. I mean, that they had a concept. It's similar to like psyche. For instance, Genesis 2 says, then Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and a man became a living soul. Right. So there's that word in the English. In the Hebrew, that's nepesh. And nepesh isn't the type of immortal soul that Christianity advocates for. It's more like the life force of the person. It refers to the whole person, their physical life, their emotions, their will. It's not some sort of generic immaterial part that survives after death. It's the person themselves, if that makes sense. So, and even when you get to areas of the Bible like Psalms, which is much sooner, I think that was around maybe 600 or 500. Psalms 42:1 is the deer pants for the streams of water, so my soul pants for you, God. Nepesh is the word that's used there. So my point is, as we're following this trajectory along, by the time Hellenism spreads through the region that is Israel, which is where the Hebrews were located, this concept comes with Hellenism of this notion of the Platonic soul. And Philo, who was a first century BCE Jewish philosopher, was heavily influenced by Platonic thought, and he integrated Greek philosophical ideas with Jewish theology. And we begin to see, it wasn't just him, of course, but that's one of the more prominent thinkers of the time, that this idea, Nepesh, begins to change to where the soul becomes more immortal. And there's some evidence of that, say, like in the book of Daniel, which was written much later. We do have some conceptions of uh, righteous people and wicked people, and wicked people will be judged. So it's not like a full notion of an immortal soul separate from the body, but it does represent the shift towards a belief in an individual soul. And by the time we get to the first century, which is when Jesus uh, was around, this is when, especially for Judaism, and especially the Pharisees, which is a branch of Judaism, at this point had really adopted this idea of there being an immortal soul. And so, as Christianity, for lack of a better term, was an offshoot of Judaism, of course, Jesus of Nazareth was Jewish, the idea of this immortal soul becomes fully developed in early Christianity, drawing on both Jewish and Greek thought, which were in the culture at the time. And so this goes on as Christianity develops. And by the time we get to Augustine, Christian theology had fully integrated the belief that the soul was immortal. So Augustine was, like I said, was deeply influenced by Platonic philosophy. He argued that the soul was created by God, distinct from the body, and eternal, and saw the soul as living on after the body's death. So that's how we get from Plato to Augustine. That was really, really fast.
I think it's essential to note that background as we're thinking about um, Augustine. Perhaps his most famous quote can reflect this. I think it's his most famous quote, but maybe it's not. Can reflect kind of at least some kind of view of the self. He says, I forget which book it's in. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
Mm,
Sure, great line, very fancy. But we can see some threads again of Platonism running through, as you mentioned, through an idea like this. Ourselves, our very natures, they're immortal, and yeah, I think yeah, they're immortal, but they're trying to rest in the form of goodness, the form of
mhm,
goodness itself. And so we can see just through that at least some kind of influence from Platonism here. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little more, but I think that's a good quote um, to think about the self, because for Augustine, the self can only be fully understood in relation to God.
mhm,
Some aspect of the human self, like we saw in Aristotle and Plato, it's missing without being in connection with the forms or itself or God.
mhm. Yeah, and another tie to Platonism, of course, outside of Jesus and the apostles, the other great influential writer of the first century was the Apostle Paul, and it's very clear as you read his epistles that he has no love for the body. The body but the body gets you in trouble. It is all the things that
Yes.
cause, very similar to the tripartite soul. It's all the things that cause lusts, gluttony, and all the vices. It comes from the body. And Romans, he has this famous section where he says, I do not know why I do what I do. It's like he has no control. And it's this, that like the world is hard and bad, and the body makes us do bad things. And the only time we'll ever really get liberated from that is when we die and our soul is finally liberated from our bodies and can join God, the good.
So I think we promised that we would hit the Hindu conception of the self too in this episode.
Yeah, yeah, we can do it real quick.
You're the expert on this. I know pretty much nothing, so I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Oh, okay, okay. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but of the two of us, I guess I know more about it. So Hinduism. Hinduism is possibly the world's oldest religion. Some people say Zoroastrianism is the world's oldest religion, but either way, very, very old. I won't go into all of its history of its development over time, but there are many sacred scriptures. And again, we've talked about it before. The separation between religion and philosophy in the East. Well, there is no separation. Religion is philosophy, and philosophy is religion. Whereas I just gave this explanation about the development of the conception, the Christian conception of the soul. I kind of said that sort of separately from philosophy, but clearly there's some philosophical influence there. Same with Hinduism, right? And so many of their scriptures are philosophically oriented. Some, of course, are prayers, rituals, things such as that. The Upanishads are the biggest ones, or probably the ones most well known and most philosophically and metaphysically oriented. Then you also have the Vedas, which are older, which deals more with songs and scriptures and prayers and rituals. One of the most influential ideas in Hinduism is the idea of what's called the Atman. The Atman is how it's spelled, Atman. The Atman in the Hindu conception is the self. That is the self, the Atman. So let me explain what the Atman is. In the Hindu conception, their supreme god is Brahman. It's different from Christianity, Judaism, and even Platonism. There is no separation. There are no two realms. All is Brahman, and Brahman is everything, and everything is Brahman. And there's a bit of Brahman in everything that exists as well, including you and me. And that bit of Brahman that is in everything, in us, is our self. It's our soul. It's the Atman. So Brahman, the Atman is Brahman, but the Atman's also yourself. So it's a very complex or different. I don't know if complex is right. It's a very different conception of a metaphysical or spiritual explanation of existence. But that is the thing that is in each one of us. That is the self. It is the Atman. It is uniquely you, but it has really no features. I always try to think of the Atman as like an egg, like some polished nickel, heavy, solid metal egg that exists inside of you, and not physically, but metaphorically. And your body is constantly in changing. The actions you take, the things you think, the physical body, it's all constantly changing. The one thing that does not change at all is that little egg that's inside of you, because of what it's composed of. It's eternal. It's immutable. It does not change.
Mm.
And once your soul, your Atman, is liberated from the cycle of rebirth, won't go into it, but the samsara, the cycle of rebirth, once it's liberated from that and rejoins Brahman in nirvana, then the cycle's over, and that's what your soul desires to do, to join with Brahman. So all to say, the Hindus had a very firm conception of the self. It was unquestionable that the self existed. And we'll get to Buddhism in another episode. But just as I said, Christianity is somewhat of an offshoot of Judaism. In other words, Christianity has some elements, well, certainly has heritage, but also some elements of Judaism in its practices. Buddhism is an offshoot of Hinduism. And one of the big differences is how they conceive of the self. So the Atman is the eternal, unchanging soul or self, which is the person's true essence of an individual and is ultimately identical with Brahman, which is the universal reality.
Mm.
So I wanted to read something from the Bhagavad Gita, but do you have any comments, Andrew?
No, I don't. It sounds very interesting, but I don't know if I can contribute anything of note.
One of the most important books is a book called the Bhagavad Gita. If you've been exposed to anything in Hinduism, this is probably the thing you've been exposed to. It's an epic. It's an epic within an epic. The larger epic is called the Mahabharata, but the Bhagavad Gita is about 700 lines that exist within the Mahabharata. This is a famous story of a prince named Arjuna and his discussions with the god Krishna, who represents Brahman. In, I think it's book 4, nope, book 2, chapter 2. There's a brief explanation of the soul, and I just wanted to read it because I think it's really beautiful. So it says here, this is line 22, chapter 2, line 22. As a man abandons worn out clothes and acquires new ones, so when the body is worn out, a new one is acquired by the self who lives within. The self cannot be pierced by weapons or burned by fire. Water cannot wet it, nor can wind dry it. The self cannot be pierced or burned, made wet or dry. It is everlasting, infinite, standing on the motionless foundations of eternity.
Mm,
The self is unmanifested, beyond all thought, beyond all change. Knowing this, you should not grieve. O mighty Arjuna, even if you believe the self to be subject to birth and death, you should not grieve. Death is inevitable for the living. Birth is inevitable for the dead. Since these are unavoidable, you should not sorrow. Every creature is unmanifested at first and then attains manifestation. When its end has come, it once again becomes unmanifested. What is there to lament in this? The glory of the self is beheld by a few, and a few describe it. A few listen, but many without understanding. The self of all beings living within the body is eternal and cannot be harmed. Therefore, do not grieve.
mm.
And I don't know if this is probably just a translation trick, but anytime it says the self in that book, it's capitalized. Not sure what that indicates, but
Mm.
much like Plato, there's no discussion as to why the Atman exists. It's just that it does, um, and it's the fundamental thing that is essentially who a human being is. And there's no reason to
Mm.
grieve at death because that thing that is essentially you will continue on.
It's interesting how we see some parallels between the different branches of philosophy, even though there was probably no initial contact between the great thinkers of those traditions. So, at least way back in the days.
It is fascinating. I'm not sure what to take from it, but I'm always so fascinated when we see similar theories. I like to sometimes compare Taoism to Stoicism. Very different, but there's some similarities in there in terms of like notions of the ego, and every civilization, I'm sure, has grappled with the idea of a soul, or what the self is, right? And this human desire, I'm sure, for the soul to continue on, for the self to continue on, right? Why wouldn't we want that? I think it's kind of,
Yeah,
I think it's just something all humans would desire, like the as Socrates says, it's either the candle gets blown out, and it's all over, which I suppose is just a nice nap, as he calls it. Or, the idea that our consciousness or our soul, something that's uniquely us, continues. I think that's a very appealing idea to humans. And so all people across the globe, grapple with this. That's all I got to say.
I think that was a good. I think that was a good way to end it.
So our next episode, we'll see this trajectory continue. There's not much to say. Of course, there's plenty to say, but there's not much to say about the medieval period in Western history regarding the self. That's not a fair statement. But essentially, we can say the Augustinian view of the self continues through the Middle Ages until we get to the very, very early. I don't even know if we'd call it Enlightenment, but Descartes in the 16th century, and this conception of the self as the cogito, right? The thing that thinks.
I'm excited to continue on with this. I think it will be a very interesting rest of the series. So make sure to stick around and keep listening. And if you are interested in learning more about a particular tradition's take on the self, feel free to send in an email and we'll try to cover it along the way.
Yep, would love that. Well, I guess we're done.
I guess
I
so.
guess we're done.
Is, will we get blown out like a candle?
Well, all things end, as
All things
and
do end.
so too it will be with this podcast episode. Thanks everyone
True.
for tuning in. We always love that you do. Send us some feedback. We think that's great too. Really boosts the soul.
That's good. Yeah, it does. It also boosts the soul when you find us and follow us on whatever podcast platforms you use. You become an official subscriber. And when you follow us on Instagram at Open Door Philosophy, and of course, when you visit our website page, opendoorphilosophy.com, or of course, when you subscribe to our YouTube channel, or of course, when you send us an email, as mentioned. We really appreciate that, and it keeps the soul going.
It does. I gotta say, the my soul has really not been excited about Instagram. So, uh, I'm so sorry, everyone. I need to get better at that. But
Me
anyway,
too.
we're there on Instagram too. I do check it. I just need to be more clever and come up with posts.
I think that if if I touch Instagram, it will not go well for either of us. But perhaps one day I will be on there.
I mean,
So
I could
I
just rip philosophy memes from Reddit and just post them. But then I feel like I'm not giving true credit to the author. I don't know how I feel about that. Anyway,
or you can come up with your own philosophy memes,
uh,
or we could post listeners' memes.
well, I'm certainly not clever enough to come up with memes. Just bad dad jokes, which maybe that's all memes
Yeah.
are. But anyway, well, everyone, thanks for listening. That's it for us this week. I hope you all out there are having a good time and you're safe. And I don't know, why am I being like a dad right now? All right. Remember, everyone, whenever your life is in need of some philosophy, the door is always open. See you later.